What's it like to be a child living without a home in New York City? Andrea Elliott joins us to talk about her new book, Invisible Child: Poverty, Survival, and Hope in an American City. How did Phoebe Robinson launch her own book imprint and publish her third book during the pandemic? The actress, writer, comedian, and producer will join us to talk about her new essay collection, Please Don't Sit on My Bed in Your Outside Clothes. Liz Harris will be here to talk about what's going on in the publishing world. Plus, my colleagues and I will talk about what we're reading. This is the Book Review Podcast from the New York Times. It's October 8th. I'm Pamela Paul. My colleague Andrea Elliott joins us now from Harlem. She is the author of a new book, her first book. It's called Invisible Child: Poverty, Survival, and Hope in an American City. Andrea, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
This book is based on a series of stories you wrote for the New York Times. Tell us about that series and when you wrote it.
So my path to Dasani began in October of 2012 when I was on the investigative desk at the Times, and I was trying to find a way into the story about the city's homeless crisis. And I wanted to specifically find a kid to write about. And at that time, there were more than 22,000 children in the shelter system. It's a crisis that continues to this day, but the numbers have dropped significantly with the eviction moratorium. At that time, that population would fill Madison Square Garden, just to give you a visual. And so I was standing in front of Auburn Family Residence, which is a homeless shelter, city-run, that was a decrepit place in Fort Greene, Brooklyn, which had become a kind of beacon of gentrification. It really captured what was happening all around Brooklyn after 2000, when people just came in and began to revitalize, it would be one way of describing it, these neighborhoods, to the people who had been living there for decades, many of them families, Black families, brown families. It felt very much like they were being pushed out. And that was the world that Dasani was growing up in. I'll never forget the moment that I met Dasani. I was standing outside the shelter, and the first person I saw was her mother, Chanel. She was walking out with her children trailing behind her in single line formation. She looked like a drill sergeant. And that image of them, that first image, the 7 children and the baby in the stroller, really has stuck with me all these years later, because it said so much about them as a family, their unity, the strength of their bond, the discipline that they showed in how they navigated the streets. Chanel had grown up on a very different street than Dasani. She'd grown up in the 80s in Eastern Brooklyn in a predominantly Black and poor neighborhood, separated from wealth, separated from lighter-skinned people. Her mother named her for the perfume that she spotted in a magazine. Dasani, her daughter, was growing up in a world, in the modern American city, essentially, which is a place, New York and other places like it. This is a city where the rich and the poor live in striking proximity. And the thing about Dasani that struck me immediately was just how quintessentially New York she was. She's such a New York kid. She was so alert and funny and curious and tough, and she had so much to say. And she had this incredible sense both of the injustice of her life. Her family was living, all 10 members of her family, crammed in one room at the shelter. They'd been living there for years. I remember saying to her at one point, "Your mom has a lot on her plate." And she said, "I've got a lot on my plate." And she started naming all the things on her plate. And they were metaphors, like the macaroni was her parents and the collard greens were her siblings.
So she was really talking about her plate.
She was talking about her plate. Her plate as a as a child who had to deal with such great burdens.
And she was 11 years old at the time?
Dasani was 11 years old when we met, and she was the second oldest of 8 children and really kind of a third parent in that home. Her parents are married, but she would do so much in the morning, right? She'd wake up around dawn, go to her window and look at the Empire State Building in her first moments of quiet. She did this every morning. This was her routine because she liked to, as she put it to me, see what was going on out there. It made me feel like something's going on out there. So that aspiration was always just a part of her character from the very beginning. It struck me as something that just kind of defined her. And even her very name is aspirational. Her mother named her after the bottled water that had just come to Brooklyn as part of this new moment of gentrification where she wondered who could even pay for water. Then she would get her siblings dressed and ready for school. And by the time most children in New York City are waking up to go to school, Dasani had been working essentially for 2 hours. And she herself would arrive often late and hungry to her own school, which was a kind of second home for her. And for children in the city who are poor, the New York public school system is a second home, or sometimes the primary home.
I want to talk a little bit about the behind the scenes, how the sausage gets made with a story like this and what eventually obviously became a book. You started off wanting to write about homelessness in New York City and poverty in New York City. How do you figure out this is the person that we're going to hang the story on, build it around? Because it's not the opposite way around, right? Where you suddenly saw this girl and then realized I need to tell her story. Were there other people that you considered? And what made you decide Dasani is the right person for this piece?
I've always believed as a journalist that the story shows itself to you, and you just have to do the work of being there and being present for as long as possible until it becomes more clear. I think in the very beginning, I thought Dasani would be a principal person, but that, in fact, in the very beginning, I had 3 families I was following at that shelter. And I had this approach that a lot of journalists take, that we need to capture 3 different families to give a sense of the spectrum of experience. But what I think becomes more important to the reader is to be able to identify deeply with one story, one protagonist, and follow that person. And this has happened in prior works of mine. I mean, I did this with an imam in Brooklyn. I spent 6 months with him. It was not my intention in the beginning. He and Dasani are very different people, but they're similar in one way, which is that they are people who want to talk and feel unheard. So I felt drawn to her, I think, because she was unlike most children, and I am the mother of 2 girls, so I know this well. She was somebody who, at a very young age, could articulate in a moving and profound way her experience. And that's a rare trait even in adults. She was aware of the injustice of her life, and she was aware of that something else that was outside her window, that thing that she was always staring at in the morning, which was the tower lights of the Empire State Building, and wanting to see what they said about that day, if it was St. Patrick's Day, if it was Jay-Z's birthday. And this constant reaching for that something else was so much a part of her persona as well. And I think the tension between what was for her, which was this room crammed with 10 family members and mice and just horrible conditions of poverty in New York City, and what could be, that tension between those two is so much the story of Dasani. And the thing that moved me the most about her was that she was trying, while surviving very difficult circumstances, constantly reaching for something else and thinking about how to get out and how to transcend.
So you knew you wanted to tell her story. And of course, it's a reciprocal relationship. Did she and her family immediately consent to talking to you, trust you with their story? How did you navigate that on her end? And also the fact that, of course, she's a minor.
This was a long and careful process. I don't regard trust as a destination in my work. I believe that trust is a work in progress at best. It's something that ebbs and flows. And I think that I did a typical job of, as any reporter would, of explaining my work and my process, showing them my previous stories and doing everything I could to convince them that I wanted to do right by their story and to tell it in a compelling way, in a deep way that they would recognize as authentic. But putting aside every pitch I made, I think really at the end of the day, and this held true for my 8 years with this family, what mattered most was something very basic, which was just that I kept showing up. And I think for them, outsiders in particular, and these can be very well-meaning outsiders, not just people who are there monitoring them or from the city, but teachers or people who've entered their lives from the outside world tend to leave. And even their own friends and family. There's just a lot of uncertainty when you are faced with housing insecurity, food insecurity. Dasani attended 8 schools by the time she was in the 8th grade, and she had lived in 6 shelters at that point. In a story like this one that for the New York Times took us about a year, that's a lot of time spent together. Ruth Fremson, the photographer, and I spent so much of that time doing what really looked like nothing to Dasani and Chanel. Ruth waited, I think, a month before she even took out her camera. And, I was also kind of just investing time more than anything. And it also helped me to begin to organize my thoughts. And what I would do is I would ride the train home back to the Upper West Side from Brooklyn. And I started making what I called train notes. And a lot of the notes from that notebook wound up almost unchanged in the book. But these were my initial observations about the relationships in that family, the tensions, the struggles, the aspirations, all the things that were striking me. I just didn't do a lot of that in front of them at first because I wanted them to feel like they were getting to know me and not being so self-conscious. I had something very early on that I used, a tool. It's a pen that records audio, and Dasani and her siblings.
Very James Bond.
Well, they called it my spy pen. They were like, that's your spy pen. And they loved it. You would take it and use it as a microphone and pretend they were on TV talking into it. I love to write with dialogue, and it was my way of making sure that I had captured everything accurately. And so I would be taking notes with this pen, but it was also recording, and then it was time-stamped. And so I could transcribe all of it, but they ended up using it as a way to interview me sometimes. Or Dasani would pretend she was a newscaster on TV. And it became a kind of way for us to connect, a tool of connection, I should say. And they were partners in telling their story from the very beginning. The New York Times gave them cameras and video cameras to record the conditions of their room because we were prevented from gaining access. So Auburn, like other city-run shelters, is closed to the public. So there's very little outside monitoring or scrutiny. Eventually, Ruth and I snuck in. Dasani went to the back of the shelter, opened the door that set off the fire alarm, and then we bolted upstairs past 4 sets of security guards. They didn't notice. I think people did this all the time. They would sneak in lovers or contraband. So I think it wasn't an unusual occurrence, but it was scary. When we got to the room, then we were able to finally be inside this experience that they had been documenting for us. But their documentation also provided a different lens, because to have Dasani pointing her camera at the different things that were occurring and having her narrate that was just as important as me seeing it directly.
It's so interesting, the relationship. In certain ways, she's a journalist of a kind doing this documentation, and you're a journalist, but it's clear you also had a close relationship with Dasani and presumably with other members of her family. Was that hard to navigate, to separate the way you felt about her as a human being, as someone who, as you pointed out, was kind of a steadying presence in her life, and your role and job as a journalist and later as an author?
To say it was hard to navigate is putting it nicely. This was and remains, I think, one of the great challenges of this kind of work. It is a real test of one's ability to hold 2 things in your mind at once, that I'm here to do a job and that I'm a human being. I think in the very beginning, I entered into this still with a more traditional view that the journalist wears the journalist hat and the subject is the person who's being written about and who's answering questions, and it's kind of a one-way street. That all went out the window because what I realized with Dasani and her mother in particular was that the way I could learn about them deeply was to converse with them and to share about my life. And I would learn so much just in the questions they asked me. So it was very much a two-way street. And I think that I came to see that this sort of more traditional notion that you're not supposed to have feelings about the people you're writing about because that makes your reporting biased potentially or lacking in so-called objectivity. I started to really question that. And I actually even came to see that not only is the feeling of empathy that one has for one's subjects okay, it's in fact essential to elevating the story in a manner that readers will respond to. I don't see it as a detriment that I had deep feelings of, at times, sadness or anger at watching the things that occurred to them. I see it as a way of doing my work. And I think that what I learned to do is just to try to balance those two things as much as possible and to understand that it's complicated and to never feel utterly comfortable with it, right? Because I think if you feel like you've kind of figured it all out, that's dangerous. You have to constantly be second guessing yourself and wondering, okay, am I getting too close here? Or do I need to step this back? How could I help more? Am I not helping enough? And I had to be so careful because we have really clear rules in our profession. There are boundaries between the reporter and the person that the reporter is writing about. So they knew that early on, but there were plenty of moments where I felt like I didn't do enough.
For an outsider, when you see someone experiencing homelessness, the first question one often asks is, well, how did they get that way? How did this happen? And I want to ask that with what I imagine are two different answers that maybe you can address. One is perhaps personal, particular to their situation, and then the larger structural or situational reasons why Dasani and her family and other families like hers are experiencing homelessness to the extent that they are in New York City.
If I had to summarize what Dasani's story is about, I would say it's not about homelessness. It's about belonging. It's about who gets to belong to a place and who doesn't. And that place is a physical place, which is New York City, but it's also a metaphorical place. It's a place that feels very different for Black and Brown families. More than 50 years after the Civil Rights Movement, more than 50 years after LBJ's declared war on poverty, this is still a city where nearly half of residents are living near or below the poverty line. And one of the first things that really struck me that made me interested in even finding Dasani was the fact that the United States has the highest child poverty rate of any superpower. And the second highest, or I guess now it's dropped down to about third or fourth, according to the United Nations, of any wealthy nation in the world. So when I started out writing about Dasani, the word homeless was a label, absolutely, that was assigned to describe her condition. And I think 8 years later, if I have taken anything away from this, it's that the label is just the point of departure for understanding the reasons why. There is no way you can look at her current homelessness without seeing the racial underpinnings of that. And yes, there are structural causes. The most important revelation, I think, in the reporting over these recent years, I had heard that Dasani's great-grandfather had fought in a distant war, and this was a kind of family legend that he used to tell these crazy stories about fighting, and no one really believed him. And so my researcher, Craig Hughes, who's been so instrumental in all of this, with Craig, I reached out to Veterans Affairs and I filed a FOIL and eventually got June Sykes's military record. He had fought in World War II as a Buffalo soldier as part of the Army's segregated all-Black regiment. And he had returned home in 1945 with 3 Bronze Stars, and then joined the Great Migration North, landed in Brooklyn with his wife. He was a trained mechanic. But this was a time when it was impossible to get a mortgage in redline Brooklyn. It was impossible as a Black family to get a mortgage in the suburbs in the 50s by then. It was very hard to find work in his profession because the labor unions were still largely closed to Black workers. And it's like every barrier faced him. And as a result, he worked very hard. He worked from the time he got to Brooklyn until he died, 30 jobs, but none of them were in his profession. And I looked at the data with a researcher from Columbia that tracked the average wages. He wound up mostly working as a janitor. And what he earned as a janitor over those years compared to what he would have earned as a mechanic, the gap in those 2 wages was about $200,000. He was unable to do the one thing that the GI Bill enabled millions of white veterans to do, and that helped create America's middle class, which is to buy a home. So much of white wealth is rooted in home ownership, right? And in how this carries over by, generations. His future generations would not be able to benefit from his own home ownership because he just wasn't able to get a mortgage. So as a result, he wound up in the public housing in Fort Greene that Dasani refers to as the projects. And he worked all of these jobs and had a really, really hard life. And this is a heroic person who should have had a very different return home from World War II.
Andrea, we are out of time, and it's very upsetting because we have touched on the very, very tip of the iceberg. But I think this will leave listeners and readers eager to get the book, to find out exactly what has happened to Dasani in the years since you reported that series. Obviously, you continued to tell her story and update it, and you can see Dasani today as she appears on the cover of the New York Times Book Review, where this book is reviewed by Matthew Desmond this week. So, Andrea,
oh my gosh,
thank you so much again. Congratulations on the book, and a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Andrea Elliott's new book is called Invisible Child: Poverty, Survival, and Hope in an American City. Something fun coming up from the book review. As part of our year-long celebration of the 125th anniversary, we're throwing a subscriber-only virtual event on October 25th. It'll be at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. Join deputy editor and regular podcaster Tina Jordan, some of our books colleagues here, and a few other faces you might recognize as we share the classic books we got wrong and some we got right, plus favorite letters to the editor, book review trivia, and more. You can RSVP at nytimes.com/bookreview125. Tina Jordan joins us now to help celebrate the 125th anniversary of the book review. Hey, Tina.
Hey, Pamela. So I'm bringing you today one of my favorite, I don't really want to call it an op-ed. It's sort of a lighthearted piece that ran in 1921, and it's called Do Your Serious Reading in the Subway. And our editor said, you can read anything you want to in the subway and no questions asked, not so much as an eyebrow lifted. If you have a book that you want to read, but that you do not want to be seen reading, the ideal spot for you is on the subway train. It doesn't matter what the book is. Goes on to say the subway crowd has seen so much of literature in the course of its comings and goings. The catching of expresses and locals and shuttles, it cannot be said to be narrow-minded. It is ridden up to 116th Street with Columbia students reading Beowulf in its native Anglo-Saxon. It is ridden downtown in the early morning with young men reading How to Recognize Total Strangers at 20 Yards. It has stumbled over young ladies of faultless fingernails engrossed in The Princess of Sinners. And it goes on to say, look, don't worry about missing your stop. That's the fear of people who take books on the train, that they're going to become so engrossed that they're going to miss their stop. We tell them, look, you're going to get used to it. And it concludes by saying, look, No one's ever going to question you about what you're reading on the subway.
No, they're just going to give you the side eye.
Now I think they might give you the side eye, but it's basically saying, look, leave your highbrow books of French verses at home and take that big sleazy novel you've been wanting to read on the train because people will care less. And I kind of love that, right?
Yep.
Anyway, and it comes with an illo. Everyone on the subway is reading a book.
And now they're on their phones.
And now they're on their phones, I know.
Thanks, Tina.
Thanks, Pamela.
Phoebe Robinson joins us now from Brooklyn. Her new book is called Please Don't Sit on My Bed in Your Outside Clothes. Phoebe, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So you have had a busy pandemic. It sounds like you have launched your own book imprint at Penguin Random House, Tiny Reparations Books. You have your third book out now. Tell us a little bit about why you wanted to start your own publishing imprint.
When I met my lit agent, Robert Ginsler, back in 2014, he had read a blog of mine and saw me on a New York stand-up comics list. So he reached out to me. And he was like, you might be writing a book, but if you're not, I would love to sit down and chat with you. And I was so excited because I wanted to write a book and I just didn't know how to go about getting an agent. So we met and I told him about my idea for my first book, You Can't Touch My Hair. And he kind of got the sense that I'm not a one and done kind of author. So he asked me what's sort of the end game for me. And I was like, well, I know Toni Morrison used to edit other people's books while she wrote her own. That sounds like too much work. So I'll just have an imprint instead. Like I had no idea what it really meant. I just was like, I love books and I want to be surrounded by books, which is a part of it, but it's a way more difficult job than I expected.
What does it involve, starting up your own imprint?
I have an editor. Her name is Amber Oliver. We go through submissions, try to figure out what fits our brand best. We really try to look for strong voices, try to reflect a multitude of experiences. There's pitch meetings where you're like, this is what we will do for you. Please come with us. We love your manuscript so much. And then there's everything from looking at and improving book covers to doing press to reading submissions, all the stuff. But it's so much fun and I really, really enjoy it. And it's really nice to see it from this side of publishing. And I really just feel like I'm getting a great education and I'm having a blast.
Oh, good. I was going to ask if it was fun because I was going to say you do a lot of fun things already that might be comparatively or might sound to maybe book people like more fun, like doing comedy and starring in TV shows and being in films. So I'm glad that the ins and outs of being a publisher are fun. Maybe not as fun. I don't know.
No, it is. I mean, it's different kinds of fun. You know what I mean? Like standing on stage and doing stand up is that taps into a different side of me, and then the book aspect hits another side of me. So it's all fun, but in different ways.
I want to talk more about the publishing, but you just touched on something that I think is really interesting, which is it a natural transition from stand-up comedy and performance to a comedic essay because you don't have access to those same tools? You have different things. I'm curious what it's like taking that kind of stand-up comedy to the page.
It certainly informs it, but book writing is a completely different style of writing than stand up. Stand up, there's a rhythm and you're aware of the laughs and how they're hitting. And with a book, you can have more flavor with it. You can be vulnerable, you can slow it down, have some downbeats, you can be really funny. So I think writing a book, there's just, I don't want to say less pressure to be funny, but it's just in a different way. You really are just trying to go with what makes you laugh as you're writing it down. I do that with everything, like whether it's stand up or writing a script or writing a book, I really try to make myself laugh. And if I can do that, then I'm off to a great start. But I wouldn't say that it's difficult to write stand up versus book writing. I think they both have their challenges, but I think with a book, I'm not really writing with an ear towards like, oh, the audience is going to laugh now. Like that just doesn't come into your head when you're writing a book. So I just really try to enjoy the moment when I'm writing and not always go for the big laugh and just really be able to be open and honest. And I think that's one of the things people really enjoy about my essays is that I'm not just always trying to be jokey, 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 but I do want to have something of substance to say too.
Well, there is a lot of serious subjects in this book: racism and performative allyship, some very personal subjects like your decision not to have children, the challenges of interracial relationships. Does writing about those kinds of personal subjects come easily to you, or do you have to coax yourself into and get yourself to go to certain places?
I think I try to be honest, and the stuff that I write about in the book are certainly things that I would say in an everyday conversation. So for me, it's not necessarily difficult. It's just more, especially in particular with the essay about deciding to not have children. I just know the stigma that women face when they decide to voluntarily not be a mother. And I think I'm still sort of in that age range. I'm in my mid 30s. And so people, I think, are still sort of like, oh, okay, you'll probably change your mind. But, I'm sure as I enter my 40s, people will be like, okay, what are you doing? Why did you decide not to have kids? And so I really just wanted the essay for anyone who's reading it, who is voluntarily child free, who, for whatever circumstances, they're unable to be a mother. I just wanted write about it and say, I think society needs to back off and stop telling women the only way they can actually be a woman is if they are a mother.
Let's go back to your publishing imprint, Tiny Reparations Books. Tell us about that name and why you chose it for your imprint.
When I used to do Two Dope Queens with Jessica Williams, we would always joke about we're too ignorant and silly to get actual reparations. Like, we're not going to get the cash, but we can get those tiny reparations, like those nice little bright spots in life. And so, as I was thinking about this imprint and what I wanted to do, and remembering how difficult it was in 2015 for me to sell my book, and people were very comfortable being like, nobody wants to read a funny essay collection by a Black woman. Black women writers aren't relatable, they don't sell. So for me, I'm looking at this imprint as a platform for me to publish women, people of color, people from the queer community, and just this is my way of giving back and just saying, if I decide to not buy your book so I can publish it, it's not because of how you identify, what you look like. And so I just really want this imprint to just be a celebration of the multitude of voices that are out there. I hope that Tiny Reparations is one of many imprints that are doing that.
How many books do you plan to publish a year?
We're slated to do 3 to 5 a year. So we currently have, including my book, 11 on the slate. So we have my book coming out this year, 5 in 2022 and 5 in 2023. So we really have hit the ground running, and we have literary fiction, nonfiction, essay collections, a little bit of poetry. We're publishing a book by a phenomenal artist named Tourmaline, who is writing a biography on Marsha P. Johnson. We have an art heist book called Portrait of a Thief, written by Grace D. Lee. And it's about 5 Chinese Americans who are hired to steal Chinese artwork from America and bring it back to China. We have a coming of age story called Portrait of a Thief, about a little girl and her oldest sister who are sent to live with their grandfather for the summer after their father passes away. So this was a lot of really good stuff here. I'm really excited.
So authors generally love their publishers. They love that there's a publisher who will publish their work. But in general, authors also often complain about their publishers. They didn't promote it right. They didn't do this. They didn't give enough money, etc. So I'm curious for you, this is your third book of essays. What may be different now that you are your own publisher? I mean, is there anyone to complain to?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's complaining myself. But, I think Plume and we've had a great rhythm with the past 2 books. And I brought my publicist, Sam, who is Indian, and Brittany, who is Black, into the fold as well. So they're involved in the publishing of all our books, because I think most people who are aware of publishing realize that it's overwhelmingly cis, straight, and white. And so if we're going to be publishing books from various backgrounds, we want to make sure that we're hitting as many kinds of outlets as possible and spreading it out there. We have a strong marketing and social media team. So we have a lot going on. We really try really hard to make sure that books are going to be supported in the way that makes an author feel good. And I remember when I wrote my first book, and Jess and I just had the Two Dope Queens podcast. And so I still really wasn't known at all. And they did a really great job of getting my book out there, finding the right people who were going to like post about it on social media, the right interviews. So we really hope that every author on the slate has an amazing experience. And if they don't, we will take that information and learn how to do better. Like, of course, no one's perfect. And so I don't think we're going to nail it every time. But as long as we keep growing and learning and doing better and doing right by authors, I think I can be proud of what we're trying to accomplish here.
All right, one more question about someone else's book, and then we'll talk more about this book. And that is Michelle Obama. Now, she probably didn't need a huge amount of support and publicity, but of course, her book had a huge and really exciting book tour, and you were a moderator on that book tour. What was that like, and how did it come about?
She was selling out arenas that held 20,000 people to talk about a book. Like, that's probably not ever going to happen again. So it was already a very surreal experience, and really cool to see people of all ages and races and, sexual orientations just to come and listen to her talk about her life and share her story, which is really, really, really cool. And it all came about because when she was figuring out her press run for Becoming, she wanted Two Dope Queens to be the one bit of non-traditional interview that she would do. And so Jess and we used to joke that the Obamas listened to the podcast, and we're like, well, okay, I guess they did. And they liked it. And so Jess and I, we took a train to DC, and we went to her office, and she couldn't have been lovelier. And she's so funny. She has 120 different stories are hilarious and smart and wonderful. So it was so great to sit down with her and interview her. And when I found out that her team and her were interested in me being a moderator on the book tour, I was kind of like, I'm available for any and all dates. Like, I was immediately so thirsty. And I was like, another first date is in Chicago. I'll do Chicago. I love Chicago. Her team was like, oh, we have someone booked for Chicago already. And I was like, who do they have booked? What is going on? And then it was Oprah, and I was like, oh, right. That makes the most amount of sense. But she's amazing and incredible, and I hope she writes another book. She doesn't need to, but I hope she does, because I really enjoyed the first one.
So your first essay in this collection is called 2020 Was Gonna Be My Year, LOL. So I think it's fair to describe this book as a quarantine project. How and why did you sit down to write? And was it because, in part at least, that a lot of the performance opportunities that might have otherwise been out there shut down with lockdown?
I wasn't really planning on writing a book last year, because before COVID, my stand-up special was supposed to come out. It's coming out October 14th. That was supposed to come out last year. My Comedy Central talk show was supposed to come out. I was developing another TV show for myself. So I was really sort of in the mind space of like, oh, let's do all these other projects, and I'll just take a break from book writing for a bit. And that was totally fine. And then when COVID happened and we were all indoors, I was really just reading a lot, like every day. I think I read something like 64 books last year. Like, it was helping me escape. It was helping me process the world and to feel better. And I just had a lot of time inside to sit and think about these things and watch what was happening with George Floyd and all the performative allyship and self-care and not having kids. And so I just was in quarantining with my boyfriend, which we are a couple who have very busy careers. He works in music touring, so he's gone a lot. Like, he's currently on the road with Guns N' Roses, and he's been gone for 10 weeks. And so that was kind of our life. Like, we were apart for a lot and come together. And so then we went into quarantine together for 15 months. And I was just sort of noticing the ways that it was funny how we were getting each other's way, but also how we were really there for each other. And I was like, oh, this could be an essay. And I was thinking about a lot of different things. I was like, this might make for a nice essay collection that certainly is of this time, but is also really touching on evergreen subject matters. And that's really how it came about. And yeah, I wrote it on the dining room table in our apartment.
You said before working on your first essay collection, speaking of reading, that you read about 15 or 20 essay collections as a kind of preparation. And I'm curious, I don't know if you probably don't remember all those titles off the top of your head, but what are some of the books that you read when you were first starting to write essays as a form? And then more generally, which essayists do you really admire?
Yeah, I mean, I read David Sedaris, Tina Fey, Mindy Kaling, Roxane Gay, Shonda Rhimes. I guess Malcolm Gladwell. I don't know. Outliers wasn't necessarily an essay, but you get it. Anyway, I just was reading. I read Issa Rae's book, Caitlin Moran, who I absolutely love. I think she's so fantastic and really funny. Nora Ephron and Samantha Irby. I love her too because it was my first book. I was just sort of like, okay, let me just see how, like, the rhythm of these books, like how much is funny, how much isn't, like how they organize the order of the essays and all that stuff. And then I have my own particular voice and style. And so I just really try to have fun with it, even though there were parts of me that was like stressed out and being like, I've never done this before. I was just a freelance writer and doing blogs and stuff. And now to go from 800 words to, I don't know, what was the first book, like 60, 70,000 words. It was really daunting. So it was good to just read those other books and be like, I'm psyching myself out, but I can actually do this.
All right, well, let's give listeners a taste. Here is from part of your first essay, which is called 2020 Was Gonna Be My Year, LOL.
My 2020 wouldn't have been what it was if it weren't for everyone who attended the final dates of my Sorry Harriet Tubman stand-up tour, especially those who confuse me for literally any other Black woman who works in Hollywood. I mean, maybe Alfre Woodard does have a tight hour-long set on her boyfriend's uncircumcised penis and living in New York City, but do you think she drank Ensure to get out of bed and perform for 150 people in Sacramento who are noshing on chicken wings? Still, this was my first solo tour, so despite the occasional audience confusion about who I was, I will cherish that tour forever. I also like to thank Duolingo, because without you, I wouldn't have been able to butcher Spanish when calling Oaxaca Taqueria to place a dinner order. Me gustaría tres carne asadas, por favor. And then lie and say, my name is Karen, as butchering another language is total Karen vibes.
That was Phoebe reading from her new essay collection, Please Don't Sit on My Bed in Your Outside Clothes. Phoebe, thank you so much again for being here.
Thank you so much. This was so fun. And I just like when anyone wants to talk about books, even if it's like not my book, even if you're just like, I want to talk about someone else's book. I don't care for your book. I'd have been like, okay, I'll show up.
Well, we got to talk about your book. Liz Harris joins us now with some news from the publishing world. Hey, Liz.
Hi, Pamela. So we've got some big awards this week. The Nobel Prize in Literature, which is considered the most prestigious world literature award, went to Abdul Razak Gurnah, which was announced on Thursday. He was born in Zanzibar, which is now part of Tanzania. He left at age 18 as a refugee after soldiers violently overthrew the government. It was in 1964. And he lives in Britain and has written several books about the immigrant experience in Britain, including Memory of Departure and Pilgrim's Way. And he is the first African to win in more than 10 years. We also got the National Book Award finalists this week, which includes Cloud Cuckoo Land by Anthony Doerr, Matrix by Lauren Groff, and Zori by Laird Hunt in the fiction category. In nonfiction, A Little Devil in America by Hanif Abdurraqib, and Grace Cho Tastes Like War, a memoir. And then in poetry, we have What Noise Against the Cane by Desiree Bailey and Floaters by Martin Espada. A few kind of notable absences were Richard Powers' newest book, Bewilderment, which has been a bestseller but has gotten mixed reviews, was not on there, and nor was The Love Song of W.E.B. Du Bois, which was another bestseller that was long listed in September. But congratulations to the finalists.
Congratulations to all of them. Thanks so much, Liz.
Thanks, Pamela.
My colleagues John Williams and Greg Coles join us now to talk about what we're reading. Hey, guys.
Hey, Pamela.
Greg, let's start with you. What are you reading?
Well, I'm reading a classic 20th century French novel that I had never gotten around to in my years of studying French. It's a 1936 book called Diary of a Country Priest by, I'm not sure I'm going to get his name right. It's Georges. His last name is maybe Bernanos, Bernanos. The book was subsequently made into a classic Robert Bresson film that I also have not seen. Part of the reason that I turned to this book now is that I've read a couple of novels recently that both incorporated religion as an overt theme or element. That's Jonathan Franzen's Crossroads. The main character is the associate pastor at a church, and the whole setting, milieu of the book takes place against this church and its youth group. And then Sally Rooney's Beautiful World, Where Are You?, which has a prominent character in it who's a practicing faithful Catholic, much to the amusement of some of the other characters. And it's rare enough in contemporary fiction, or really in urbane contemporary life overall, for religion to feature, that both Franzen and Rooney have characters kind of preemptively mock it. There's something almost shamefully earnest about it. And maybe that makes sense because I feel like religion and literature are in some ways rivals. They're like competing channels for a certain kind of questing personality. But for the same reason, they make really natural companions. And I'm always surprised that there aren't more like Marilyn Robinsons or Flannery O'Connor's true believers who use fiction to explore their faith. So The Diary of a Country Priest. It's exactly what the title says it is. It's a novel, but it's written as the year-long journal of a young Catholic parish priest sent out to a rural village in France. He's physically unwell. We learn in the first chapter that he's been turning a wan, pale yellow over the past year, and we'll eventually learn he has stomach cancer. He's probably 30 years old or so. This is his first assignment out of seminary. He's also mentally unwell. He's contending with that whole lost generation type boredom. I say lost generation type boredom. It's really just boredom, the human condition. And spiritually, it's not that he's unwell. He's not a doubter. He's devout in his faith, but he is uncertain how best to practice his faith in the world. He doesn't feel like he fits in among the villagers, who are these rural peasant types. In some ways, the time period and the setting of the book reminded me of another book I talked about on the podcast last year, John Berger's Pig Earth, which was also about rural France, the peasantry and the encroachment of modern times at the early part of the 20th century. So this priest, I'm not sure he ever gets a name in the book. He feels like he doesn't fit in. He makes the rounds. He feels like the people don't necessarily, they're practicing, but he feels like they don't feel the same spiritual impulse that he does, and they maybe mock him a little. In some ways, he's a lot like the associate pastor in the Franzen book, where he's very earnest and not sure how to cope with a parish that's maybe less earnest than he is. And he's just constantly struggling to reconcile what in theological terms, I guess you'd call the competing parts of the Trinity, weighing which has most relevance to him and to the people that he serves. And that's pretty much the plot of the book. It's not, an action thriller. He gets progressively less healthy. It grants tremendous access to a troubled and faithful soul in a way that fulfills what we expect from both literature and from religion. And
is it shortish, or is it?
No, it's about 300 pages, maybe just under 300 pages. So it's not, the last book I read before this was Annette Gordon Reed's On Juneteenth, which, you just fly through.
Sounds like it goes at about the regular pace of 300 pages.
Yeah, that's right. How about you, John?
I am just about finished with Colm Tóibín's new novel, The Magician, which he talked about recently on the podcast, I thought, very well. It is, as listeners to that episode will know, the life, or a novel based on the life of the German writer Thomas Mann, who won the Nobel Prize and wrote The Magic Mountain and Buddenbrooks and Death in Venice. It follows it doesn't follow directly, but it is similar in a sense to Tóibín's 2004 novel, The Master, which was about a few years in the life of Henry James. These are the two books that I think stand out in his bibliography that are written about famous writers. And I really loved that book, which I read almost way back then, so it's been a while. But for whatever reason, I was hesitant to pick this one up. The things that I was reading about it, even the positive things, just didn't, I don't know, they made it sound maybe a bit less rich than The Master, but it's very different, but I actually enjoyed it a great deal. The Master is a really internal book. You get a sense of James's interior life. It's a melancholy book. It's a bit of a psychological book. And this is more of Tobin looking at the grand canvas of history and putting Mon and his family against it and just moving through those events. And you actually don't get a lot, I don't think, of what I would call psychology. You sort of see everything from the outside. But as such, I think it's incredibly well done. There's a wryness to it. He can be very funny in brief moments. And there's also just a sense of the family moving out of Germany before and during the war, and the ways in which they're endangered, but the ways in which they continue to live and if not thrive, to be themselves, I guess. You sort of see people living in this tumultuous time in history without the history overtaking the story in a strange way. His children are all very interesting characters, very lively people. And I don't know, he sets this whole thing spinning in a way that I found it had a page-turning quality to it, which is not how I would describe The Master. Even though I read it fairly quickly, I could see someone getting a little bit bogged down in it. This, to me, is a bit more, I think once you're in its grip, it moves pretty quickly. I don't know if either one of you has read it.
I have not. I'm curious because I did read The Master, and it felt very much there like he had immersed himself in the work of Henry James and was a little bit channeling Henry James in writing it. So there's almost like a cover version sense.
No, that's right.
And I wonder if he's doing the same thing with Mon here.
I don't think so. And that's the funny thing, is that the Henry James book, that's a very difficult person to cover, but I think you're exactly right. It gave you some of the feeling of a James book and of his style, which was quite something, and I thought very impressive and bold. This is, I would not say that he is trying to immerse you in either his style or his consciousness. It is Tobin's style. And it even the kind of the somewhat awkward thing occasionally is that he'll do something like, Mon sat down to write his novel Buddenbrooks. And you're like, okay, well, that's a little on the nose. I mean, you could sort of hint what he's doing and not give me the sort of Forrest Gump recreation of it. Pamela, what are you reading these days?
Well, I recently read a book that I'm just going to say flat out is one of the best narrative nonfiction books by a journalist I've ever read.
Now we're talking. Here we go.
I cannot recommend it highly enough. I urge everyone to read this book, even if they're not interested in the subject on the surface. So the book is called The Outlaw Ocean: Journeys Across the Last Untamed Frontier by Ian Urbina, who is a former investigative reporter for the New York Times. He was here for 17 years. I actually never met him, although he was on the podcast when this book came out in 2019. This book is about maritime law, the lack of maritime law, and the abuses of nearly non-existent maritime law, which is to say, most of the earth, as we know, is covered with ocean, and most of that ocean is not governed by anyone. I mean, there are some loose international agreements and laws that no one is able to or willing or has the money or desire sometimes to enforce, and that therefore is an enormous cesspool of international crime that goes on, that everyone is aware takes place, and very little is done about it. And so there is slavery at sea. There is, of course, piracy, which is probably the thing that we've heard most about. People know Captain Phillips. People think about Somalia, but that piracy is all over the place. That piracy is what you would expect, which is it's theft at sea. And why wouldn't it be rampant? Because there are no police officers out there. There's no CIA or FBI. There is no one that can cover the huge, vast stretches of ocean where all of this crime takes place. Illegal fishing is just one of the many issues in the book that's covered, and what you find out will absolutely appall you, not just in terms of the environmental devastation, but the exploitation of workers, and exploitation in terms of indentured servitude, in terms of outright slavery, physical and emotional abuse, the conditions that we sometimes read about in developing nations with regard to factory conditions are nothing compared to what it is at sea. The detail in this book, I could talk about this for a very long time. I'll say a few things specifically about what makes it so good. It's not just the subject matter. It's the way in which Urbina structures his story. Unlike some journalists where a book is kind of created based off a series of articles, it always feels like a coherent whole. You never feel like, okay, and now we're at the next story that he reported. And he very deftly interweaves behind the scenes how I did this. He doesn't overly rely on the first person narrative. It doesn't feel like an egotistical book. He explains, you might be wondering how I got this person to talk to me, or you may be wondering how I got aboard this vigilante ship that's going after illegal poachers because, no government will. And the way he gets aboard them is like, it's worthy of a movie. And then the other thing that I think makes it so powerful is that it's a little bit like when the movie Apollo 13 was being made. I remember there was some kind of interview with Ron Howard, the director, or with Tom Hanks, in which they said, we made the decision not to embellish this at all because the simple facts of what happened are so insane that it's hard enough to believe it as it is. Like, there's just no reason to exaggerate. And that's the way this book feels. It feels like very journalistically responsible. There's no exaggeration. If anything, it is very low key. And yet, for a nonfiction book, I found it to be one of the most page-turnery books I've read in a long time. I stayed up late reading. I woke up early to read. I was reading in the middle of the night. So there you have it, The Outlaw Ocean.
I know you've read a great deal of reported nonfiction, so if you're saying it's one of the best things you've read, then that's a huge recommendation.
It is so good. I basically, if you don't care, even if you don't care about the ocean, you should read this book, is what I'm saying. But let's run down the titles of what we all read.
I read Diary of a Country Priest by Georges Bernanos.
I read The Magician by Colm Tobin.
And I read The Outlaw Ocean, Journeys Across the Last Untamed Frontier by Ian Urbina. Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books. And you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. I write back, not right away, but I do. The Book Review Podcast is produced by the great Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media, with a major assist from my colleague John Williams. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.